Hi guys, today we're going to work on learning 4 really simple watercolor techniques that you can use in a variety of projects. So for this you're going to need watercolor paper or some sort of heavy mixed media paper, watercolors of course, water, brush, paper towel, and you're going to want a pen or a pencil or something, and you want to be able to draw a number of spaces and label them with the names of the techniques. I'm going to be using a note card just to make sure my spaces are the same size and shape, but you certainly don't need to do that. You could even consider folding your paper in half and then in half again to create 4 equal sections. That would work too. So I'm going to take my note card and I'm going to take my Sharpie pen, and I'm just going to trace my note card 4 times. And the only thing that you really want to make sure you do is that you don't have the note card touch each other. So I don't want to line it up so it's touching it. I want to give it a little bit of a gap so that my watercolors don't bleed together when I'm working on my techniques. It's okay if they're not perfect, if you make the edges a little wobbly or something, no big deal. We just want to get 4 equal sections. So I've created my 4 spaces and I've labeled them with the names of the 4 techniques we're going to learn today. Now there are many more watercolor techniques beyond just the 4 we're going to do today. I will have some of those other videos I have made linked below if you want to check out some more techniques, but these 4 are really popular, really common, and really easily used in a variety of different ways. So these are the 4 we're going to focus on. So the first one is 1 color gradient, 2 color blend, dry brush, and wet on wet. Now before we start painting, we're going to need to activate our paints. So I am using the Crayola Education watercolors. Love these. They're very affordable. They also are very pigmented. They blend really well. They're just really nice quality, I think, for educational purposes. So I'm going to do my dip and drip technique, which is dipping my brush in my water and dripping it into the colors that I intend on using. I do this so that I can activate the dry watercolor and give it a chance to soften and mix with the water on its own. It helps save me a little bit of time, and it gives me a chance to let them kind of soften on their own without me having to sit here and swish, swish, swish forever. Okay, once you have 3 or 4 colors, you really don't need a lot of colors since we're just practicing. You'll be ready to begin. And what we're going to do first is 1 color gradient. So a gradient is basically transitioning from one tone to another. In this case, we're using 1 color, so we're actually going to be shading. So we're going to create a dark tone and we're going to lighten it up as we go along. The rule with watercolor is that the more water you add, the lighter the color will be, and the less water you add, the darker it will be. That's a really important rule to know because you can actually do a lot of lightening and darkening without using black or white, which is a really cool feature. So I'm going to take a brush full of watercolor pigment and I'm going to paint inside of my space, and I am going to try to be careful and stay inside of my space. This is a really good time to practice craftsmanship, practice trying to stay inside the space. If you're someone whose brush and hand wiggles and wobbles a lot, a good tip is to have your hand resting on your surface. That gives your hands some stability. So that's just a fun little tip to help you if you're trying to be a little bit more careful. And after I've gotten about halfway through my space, I'm going to take my brush, clean it off, and then use a brush full of just water, because remember, more water I add, the lighter the color will be. And I'm going to just re-wet the center here, and I'm basically going to pull the color that I have and fill in the remainder of my space. And you should end up with a really nice shaded rectangle. Now, a couple things. If you find that it's not really shading, it all looks exactly the same tone, you don't really see a dark side and a light side, a couple ways we can fix that. One is to add more pigment to the side that you want to be darker. The second thing you can do is something called lifting. Lifting is where you take your brush and you lift some of the color off of the paper so it lightens it. So if your paint is already wet, that's great. If it's not wet already, you can re-wet it using your brush full of water. And then use your brush like it's a mop, kind of just press and lift the color up and soak it up. and dry it off onto a paper towel or a placemat or something like that, and that will lighten some of the areas. All right, we're done with one color gradient. Now we're moving on to two color blend. Two color blend is exactly how it sounds. You're going to take one color on one side, one on the other, and we're going to blend it together to create a third color or a third tone right in the middle. For this exercise, it really doesn't matter if the color you lay down is light or dark. I do recommend picking colors that are different from each other though. So for example, I would not paint with light blue and then dark blue, or even light blue and like purple might be really kind of similar to each other. I would pick colors that are a little bit more different. Again, I'm going to paint until I get about halfway through my space that I've drawn. Then I'm going to take my brush, clean it off, and I'm going to transition to my second color of choice. And I'm going to fill in the opposite side with that. Now you'll notice I left a little bit of a white gap in between because I want to make sure I leave that until I'm ready to blend the two together. I want to make sure I have two totally saturated, clear, opposite colors before I do my blending. Once you feel like you've got two really good colors, we're ready to blend. I'm going to take some more paint of the color I just did. In this case, it's yellow, and I'm going to start doing a back and forth motion, and I'm going to start going on top of the other color. And I'm going to keep going in that direction until I hit a little ways. I don't want to go all the way to the end, otherwise I'm going to lose that color. And now I'm going to go backwards. I'm going to go back into the previous color. And the reason why I'm doing this back and forth is I'm trying to create a smooth blended transition. I want to make it look like this color is very naturally fading into the other color. And I can achieve that by painting back and forth while they're both wet. Now this is fine, but I do have these kind of like harsh defined lines there, and I really don't want that. So I'm going to clean my brush off, get a little bit more of the yellow that I had been working with, and just go on top of that area. And I'm just going to go back on top of this green area so that I can try to blend them a little bit better. The key, the little trick to blending really well, is blending the colors when they're both wet. When things are wet, they'll blend into each other much more seamlessly and beautifully than if they're dry. Now this side's looking pretty well blended and seamless. Now I'm going to do the same to the other side. And I'm just going to blend back and forth with the blue just on the area where I feel like it looks like it could use a little bit of help. And now I think my transition looks a lot smoother and a lot neater. Okay, moving on to dry brush. Dry brush is probably the technique that's most like normal painting, the kind of painting you might be used to if you're using tempera or acrylic or something like that. So for this, you need wet paint, but your brush is supposed to be dry. So far, every time I've painted, my brush has been wet with water. This time, I want to make sure I dry my brush off. Now, it doesn't have to be 100% perfectly dry. If it's like damp, that's fine. But you just want to get it mostly dry so you don't see a lot of water coming out of it anymore when you put it on paper. And I'm going to pick any color I want, and you can just sort of draw with your brush any sort of designs or shapes you feel like. The nice thing about dry brushes is this is great if you're trying to do really specific details, if you're trying to get inside small tiny places, if you just want the color to be flat and have more of a traditional painted look. Dry brush is fantastic for that. The other cool thing you can do with dry brush is you can actually make some cool textures with it. So I'm going to take my brush full of my magenta, and I'm going to actually wipe off a lot of the magenta. I don't want to wipe it off completely. I don't want to wash it off. I just want to wipe it onto something so that there's very, very little paint left in the brush. And then using sort of a stippled up and down technique, I'm going to lay down some texture here. This technique is fantastic if you're trying to do something realistic or organic, like let's say trees, the leaves on trees, bushes, even textures on rocks or mountains. This is the kind of thing that people will use to do that. You can even layer it with a second color, and that can help create some depth to your color. This is also amazing if you're trying to do, let's say, fall leaves on a tree. Layering these colors together can look really, really beautiful. So both of these techniques would be considered dry brush. This is more of a textured type of thing. This is more of a drawing, well-defined type of thing. One additional tip when you're doing this texture technique, don't take your brush and smash it up and down so that it really spreads the bristles out. You'll ruin your brush that way. Instead, try to use the side of it, or even use an old brush, a brush you don't care about at all or that already is ruined. That actually is fantastic for texture. So don't throw away those old nasty brushes. You can always use them for something cool like this. Last technique, and perhaps one of my favorites, is wet on wet. Wet on wet is where you put wet paint on wet paper, and it's going to create a really loose, kind of wild tie-dye effect. It's pretty much the opposite of dry brush, the exact opposite. It's the most out of control technique, but I really love it. First, you want to make sure you have some paint wet and ready to go, and then we're going to wet the paper and drip and drop the paint colors into it. This is going to be sort of a speed painting thing. You're going to want to make sure you are taking your water and painting as quickly as you can, because we don't want this water to dry out. And if it does dry out, you'll have to re-wet it, because the effect won't really work well if it's really, really dry. So I'm adding some. If you're working with a space that's way too big and you're just worried about it drying out on you, you could just do a little section at a time. Maybe work with this section and then work on this section. I'm going to try to do it all at once, but if you need to break it up and just do like half of it and then the other half later, that's fine. Some people need to do that, especially if you're working with a smaller brush in a really big area. Sometimes you have to break it up into small chunks. And now I'm ready to drop my paint into it, and what you should see is that the paint should be spreading out, almost looking like little fireworks. Add additional colors to it if you'd like. You can do this with just one color, but I like to add at least 2, maybe even 3 colors. I wouldn't go too much more than that. Sometimes that can make it really muddy and kind of gross. You can either let them naturally bleed into each other the way they naturally want to go, or you can take your brush and help push them around to help mix them up a little bit more than they normally would want to. Again, be careful with what colors you choose to put together, because if you put, let's say, complementary colors, which are colors that are opposite from each other, or all 3 of the primary colors, you can very easily get brown, which you can see I'm starting to get in some areas, and that's totally okay if that happens to you, but just know that that is something you need to be aware of. Wherever you put the water, that's where the paint's going to go. So if you go outside the lines, you're going to have the paint go outside the lines, so just be careful with that. And if you have any pooling or any big puddles of water that you don't really like, just do that lifting technique again. Just dry that brush off, tap it down into the area that you want to clean up. Don't rub it, just tap it, and then you can soak up the paint color and get it onto your brush and lay it onto a placemat or a paper towel. All right, here's the 4 techniques we learned today in their completion. I hope you guys had a lot of fun with it. I hope you learned some new things, and I hope you enjoy applying them to all of your future painting projects. Have fun.